This is the Eric John Phelps Show on 24/7 World Radio. And now, Eric John Phelps.
Welcome. And again, I say welcome to the broadcast today here at 24/7 World Radio with Brother Eric John Phelps coming your way today from the bustling metropolis of Newmanstown, Pennsylvania. And we have a little chemtrail today and their little tic-tac-toe formations. So maybe we're doing something down here that the Jesuit order doesn't like. So we're going to get sprayed here. Anyway, this today is my final day on the topic of Protestant Thanksgiving or Puritan Thanksgiving. Actually Puritan, Separatist, Congregationalist, Baptist Thanksgiving. And as opposed to Roman Catholic secular Thanksgiving that began really with Lincoln and finally perfected by that servant of the devil himself, Franklin Damnable Roosevelt. And we shall see that there are two Thanksgivings. One is of the Lord, as initially established in the Plymouth colony. Of course, Virginia lays claims to a Thanksgiving too, but primarily to the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts, which is a Puritan Thanksgiving that was historically celebrated in the last Thursday of November, versus the War between the states, War of Southern Annihilation by the Yankee Union hordes, led by their great communist himself, Abraham Lincoln, who wickedly called out 75,000 quote-unquote volunteers to invade the South through Virginia to South Carolina to stop that state from seceding. And Virginia said, no, you're not coming through Virginia to do that. So Virginia, at the last moment, they seceded. And they were the last state to secede in the South. They didn't want to do it. The foundation for our country is really in Virginia, the great statesman out of Virginia. But Lincoln was a tyrant, and hence he sought to destroy the Protestant South under the guise of saving the Union. And then it went on to be freeing the slaves. So we're going to decimate the South. We're going to destroy a whole civilization for freeing the slaves. So Abraham Lincoln was a criminal. You must know that. Later on, towards the end of his life, he had an evident repentance, and he did not want to go along with the centralization of power, for which purpose the war was waged. And so the Jesuits, using their agents in the Confederate Secret Service, as well as the Northern intelligence operations, led by the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, they coordinated the assassination of Lincoln, coordinated by Bernardine F. Wiggett, the Jesuit out of Georgetown, who was the overseer of Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, who then oversaw the generals in the Army that would participate and make sure that John Wilkes Booth and his buddy Harold would be able to flee Washington City. And John Wilkes Booth goes on to die in Oklahoma, and what ended Oklahoma in 1903 thereabouts, according to the book Finis L. Bates's The Escape and Suicide of John Wilkes Booth. So it was a huge conspiracy on the part of men in the North and men in the South, Masonically connected, for the assassination of Lincoln, because Lincoln did not want to go along with the centralization of power in Washington. He did not want this republic to become a national republic under the 14th Amendment, which the Reconstruction Acts, the three Reconstruction Acts, was a preview to what the 14th Amendment would accomplish. And that's when the North imposed military government in the South, divided the South into 5 military districts, led by their most vicious Yankee Union generals in the South, one of them being Butler the Beast out of New Orleans. And so until the South would have reconstructed governments and go through the forms of ratifying the 14th Amendment, we're going to put these people under a horrible, terrible persecution. That's not government by consent. And Lincoln was against Reconstruction. He was against centralization of power. And the movie Birth of a Nation rightly portrays Lincoln as a friend of the South, wanting to bring the South back into the same relationship it had before the war. And hence, this was not going to be allowed because the whole purpose of killing over 700,000 American men in that war was to centralize power in Washington and make Washington, District of Columbia, Rome on the Potomac, modeled after Rome, and the 50 states would be reduced to 50 conquered subordinate provinces under the commander-in-chief in Washington, which when military government is going to be created in 1933 with FDR, the Jesuits will have their empire to wage war around the world for the benefit of the Pope. So we get into the flow of history here now, and I want to go back to reviewing just a little bit more of the Puritan Thanksgiving under William Bradford. And so we read from his journal, page 212 of the work, The Christian History of the Constitution of the United States of America. Anno Domini 1623. This 1623 is going to be the year of true Thanksgiving. They will have a Thanksgiving in 1621. Well, they'll enter into treaty with the Indian nation that they were there with, and I covered that in a previous broadcast. But the 1623 is the truly great Thanksgiving because this Thanksgiving proves that when men have their own plots of ground and they plant their own food, they have a bumper harvest. So it destroys the Jesuit doctrine of collectivism, communism, socialism, and it establishes the biblical doctrine of laissez-faire, free enterprise. Men have their own property. They're motivated to prosper for the benefit of themselves and others, and hence you have a laissez-faire, free enterprise, truly capitalistic economy, as further championed by the great Englishman Adam Smith, that came out, by the way, with his Wealth of Nations in the very year of American independence in 1776. So this is what's going on. Evil versus good. Collectivism, socialism versus individual enterprise. So we read how individual enterprise in the Plymouth colony proved a great, wonderful blessing to these people there, to our brethren there. So Anno Dom, year of our Lord, 1623, William Bradford. It may be thought strange that these people should fall to these extremities in so short a time, being left completely competently provided when ye ship left them, and had an addition by that moiety of corn that was got by trade, besides much they got of ye Indians, where they lived by one means and another. It must needs be of great disorder, for they spent excessively while they had or could get it, and it may be wasted part away among ye Indians, for he yet was their chief, was taxed by some amongst them for keeping Indian women. How truly I know not. And after they began to come into wants, many should away their clothes and bed coverings. Others, so base they were, became servants to the Indians, and would cut them wood and fetch them water for a capful of corn. Others fell to plain stealing, both night and day, from ye Indians, of which they grievously complained. In ye end they came to that misery that some starved and died with cold and hunger. So they ate their food, they became in want, they became slaves to the Indians, some stole from them, and some died from starvation. It shows you how quickly a people blessed of the Lord can degenerate into wickedness. Continuing, this was ye end of these that sometime boasted of their strength, being all able lusty men, and that now what they should do to bring to pass in comparison of ye people here, who had many women and children, and weakens among them, and said at their first arrival, when they saw the wants here, that they would take another course, and not to fall into such a condition as this simple people were come to. But a man's way is not in his own power. God can make you weak to stand. Let him also that standeth take heed lest he fall. That's 2 Corinthians 10. All this while no supply was heard of, neither knew they when they might expect any. So they began to think how they might raise as much corn as they could and obtain a better crop than they had done, that they might not still thus languish in misery. At length, after much debate of things, the governor, pardon me, which was Carver at that time, which he advised of ye chiefest among them, gave way that they should set corn every man for his own particular, and in that regard trust to themselves. This is called individual initiative, okay? Free enterprise. And in all other things to go on in the general way as before. And so assigned to every family a parcel of land, according to the proportion of their number for that end, only for present use, but made no division for inheritance, and ranged all boys and youth under some family. This had very good success, for it made all hands very industrious, so as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any means your governor or any other could use, and saved him a great deal of trouble and gave far better content. The women now went willingly into the field, and took their little ones with them to set corn, which before would allege weakness and inability, whom to have compelled would have been thought great tyranny and oppression. So now the women were willing to go plant because they were going to have something after they planted it. See, when personal gain is there, they're going to work harder. There's nothing wrong with the desire to prosper. And it was not greed. It was a matter of staying alive. Okay, the experience that was laid in this common course and condition, tried sundry years, and that amongst godly and sober men may well evince the vanity of that conceit of Plato and other ancients. Remember, Plato was a communist. Plato's republic was collectivism, was communism. It was sin and evil. Okay. The modern day counterpart of Plato's republic is Sir Thomas More's Utopia. Sir Thomas More was another Roman Catholic traitor to his king, and he writes Utopia, and he lived at the same time, a contemporary of Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. So we have Sir Thomas More and Plato advocating collectivism, socialism, and the Bible-believing Puritans advocating each individual have their own plots of land to grow their own food. And we shall see how this succeeded. So, we read. The experience that was had in the common course and condition tried sundry years, namely 3 years, and that amongst godly and sober men may well evince the vanity of the conceit of Plato and other ancients, applauded by some of later times, that ye taking away of property and bringing in community into a commonwealth would make them happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. For this community, so far as it was found to breed much confusion and discontent, and retard much employment that would have been to their benefit and comfort. For ye young men that were most able and fit for labor and service did repine that they should spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children without any recompense, and rightfully so, I would add. The strong or man of parts had no more in division of victuals and cloths than he that was weak and not able to do a quarter, the other could. This was thought injustice. Of course it is. That's from each according to his ability and to each according to his need. That's communism. That's socialism. That's what the Jesuits perfected on their reductions. And this was tried here in the Plymouth colony, and it utterly failed. It's failing here in America with this socialist, communist, economic government we have here, this military government. Continuing. The aged and graver men to be ranked and equalized in labors and victuals, clothes, etc., with the meaner and younger sort, thought it some indignity and disrespect unto them. And for men's wives to be commanded to do service for other men, as dressing their meat and washing their clothes, etc., they deemed it a kind of slavery, neither could many husbands well brook it. Upon you point, all being to have alike, and all to do alike, they thought themselves in like condition, and one as good as another. This is what C.S. Lewis wrote in his tremendous work, Screwtape Proposes a Toast, in his Screwtape Letters, and he said, as he's giving the words of a demon, we will raise up men, and we will all have this cry, that I'm as good as you, I'm as good as you. Every man cut down to the lowest common blade of grass. This I'm as good as you is sheer communism and socialism. Continuing on. And so if it did not cut of those relations that God has set among men, yet it did at least much diminish and take of ye mutual respects that should be preserved amongst them, and would have been worse if they had been men of another condition. Let none object, this is men's corruption, and nothing to ye coarse in self. I answer, seeing all men have this corruption in them, God in his wisdom saw another course fitter for them. And we shall read of this after a break here at 24/7 World Radio.
This is the Eric John Phelps Show on 24/7 World Radio.
This is Brother Nicholas. Join me every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the German Bible Truth Hour and at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the Dutch Bible Truth Hour on 24/7 World Radio. This is Bruder Nicholas. Ich lade euch herzlich ein, mich anzuhören jeder Dienstag am 2 Uhr nachmittags, amerikanische Zeit, für die deutsche Bibelwahrheitsstunde und 3 Uhr amerikanische Standardzeit für die niederländische Bibelwahrheitsstunde am World Radio 24/7. Dit is broeder Nico. U bent hartelijk uitgenodigd om elke dinsdag om 2 uur Amerikaanse standaardtijd het Duitse Bijbelwaarheidsuur te volgen en 3 uur Amerikaanse standaardtijd het Nederlandse Bijbelwaarheidsuur te volgen op 24/7 World Radio.
This is 24/7 World Radio, and you're listening to The Eric John Phelps Show.
Colony and the first Thanksgiving, which is really in fact 1623. I want to show you what led up to this, how they went from collectivism, socialism, to individual free enterprise, individual property ownership, and with that had a bumper crop, which acts as a complete and total rebuke to any form of socialism imposed by any government. And in my new country of Probaptical, when I established part of somewhere here in Pennsylvania, so anybody who advocates socialism will commit a capital offense. You want to advocate socialism of taking from the producer and giving to the non-producer, you're a thief. And when you do that in the Capitol building of advocating theft, taking from those who produce to give to those who don't produce, you are now worthy of death. So we'll immediately have a trial right there in the Congress. You have now been accused of advocating socialism by your own words, by this bill you put forward here. And now the only punishment for that is death. We have any objections? Nope. Take them out. The sergeant at arms can put them against the wall and shoot them. That's how you handle communism and socialism. Theft. Jesuit theft. That's what's wrecked America. That's what's wrecked Canada. White Protestant Canada, white Protestant America, white Protestant England, white Protestant Scotland, white Protestant Sweden, white Protestant Germany, Denmark, all of our history, Australia, New Zealand. All this filthy socialism is a religion based upon the innate goodness of man, which is total heresy. Man is basically evil. Christ said, if you being evil know how to give good gifts, how much more shall your Father give to you, those of you who ask? Man is evil. Hence, socialism can never work, especially when the evil, wicked criminals in the government putting socialism upon a people are in charge of it. They become super rich. Just like in Russia, like USSR, like in China, like in Washington. But going on. We read now concerning the end of collectivism. But to return, after this course settled, and by that their core was planted, all their victuals were spent, and they were only to rest on God's providence. At night not many times knowing where to have a bit of anything ye next day. And so, as one well observed, had need to pray that God would give them their daily bread, and above all people in the world. Of course, because these people knew the Lord. And those are the ones the Lord would give his daily bread to. He's not obliged to give daily bread to anybody who rejects his son, who has nothing to do with Christ, who rejects the gospel, who hates the Hebrew Jewish Israelites. God's not under any obligation to give any of those people their daily bread. Yet they bore these wants with great patience and alacrity of spirit, and that for so long a time as for most part of 2 years, they having but one boat left, and she not over well fitted, they were divided into several companies, 6 or 7 to a gang or company, and so went out with a net they had bought to take bass and as such like fish, by course every company knowing their turn. No sooner was ye boat discharged of what she brought, now, apparently it was 98 fish, but ye next company took her and went out with her. Neither did they return till they had caught something, though it were 5 or 6 days before. For they knew there was nothing at home, and to go home empty would be a great discouragement till ye rest. Yea, they strive who should do best. If she stayed longer, or got little, then all went to seeking of shellfish, which at low water they digged out of ye sands. And this was their living in your summertime, till God sent them better. And in winter they were helped with ground nuts and fowl. Also in ye sooner they got now and then a deer, for 1 or 2 of ye fittest, and appointed to range ye woods for Yaten. And what was got that way was divided amongst them. At length they received some letters from ye adventurers, too long and tedious here to record, by which they heard of their further crosses and frustrations. Now, here we're going to have a Jesuit coadjutor sent out of England for the purpose of attempting to destroy the Plymouth colony. And this Jesuit coadjutor's name was John Pierce, because he wants to destroy it. Who benefits when you destroy a Puritan colony? Does not Rome benefit? Do not the Jesuits benefit? Remember, the Jesuits have been in existence here now for 80 years. Came into existence in 1540 with the Pope, actually 1534, but brought into the papacy by the Pope in 1540, Paul III. And this is now 1621 to 23. So the Jesuits have set out to destroy the Plymouth colony. And they're going to attempt this by this John Pierce. This ship was brought by Mr. John Pierce and set out at his own charge upon hope of great matters. These passengers and ye goods the company sent in her, he took in for freight, for which they agreed with him to be delivered here. This was he in whose name their first patent was taken by reason of acquaintance, and some alliance that some of their friends had with him. But his name was only used in trust. But when he saw that they were here hopefully thus seated, and by ye success God gave them, had obtained a favor of ye council of New England, he goes and sues to them for another patent of much larger extent in their names, which was easily obtained. But he meant to keep it to himself and allow them what he pleased, to hold of him as tenants, and sue to his courts as cheerful lord, as will appear by that which follows. Reducing everybody to tenants on the land. That's what they did to us on March 9th, 1933 here in America, with all these quote-unquote U.S. citizens. But ye Lord marvelously crossed him, for after this first return, and ye charge above mentioned, when she was again fitted, he pesters himself and takes in more passengers, and those not very good to help to bear his losses, and sets out the second time. And now, Bradford makes a comment. He says, I may not here omit how, notwithstand all their great pains and industry, and ye great hopes of a large crop, the Lord seemed to blast and take away the same, and to threaten further and more sore famine unto them by a great drought, which continued from ye 3 weeks in May till about the middle of July, without any rain, and with great heat for ye most part, insomuch as ye corn began to wither away, though it was set with the moisture whereof helped it much. Yet at length it began to languish sore, and some of ye drier grounds were parched like withered hay, part whereof was never recovered. Upon which they set apart a solemn day of humiliation, to seek ye Lord by humble and fervent prayer in this great distress. And he was pleased to give them a gracious and speedy answer, both to their own and the Indians' administration, and the Indians' admiration that lived amongst them. For all ye morning and greatest part of the day it was clear weather, and very hot, and not a cloud or any sign of rain was to be seen. And yet toward evening it began to overcast. Kind of reminds me of Elijah when he was praying for rain. And shortly after to rain, with such sweet and gentle showers as gave them cause of rejoicing and blessing God. It came without either wind or thunder, or any violence, and by degrees in yet abundance, as that ye earth was thoroughly wet and soaked therewith, which did so apparently revive and quicken ye decayed corn and other fruits, as was wonderful to see, and made ye Indians astonished to behold. And afterwards the Lord sent them such seasonable showers with interchange of fair, warm weather, as through his blessing caused a fruitful and liberal harvest, to their own no small comfort and rejoicing. For which mercy in time convenience they also set apart a day of thanksgiving, thus being overslipped in its place, I thought meet here to insert ye same. This is the beginning of Thanksgiving in 1623. And they're going to have a bumper crop where God begins to intervene, sends them rain to the utter unbelievable, under astonishment of the Indians. He goes on back to this conspirator, John Pierce. He says, about 14 days after came in this ship called Ye Anne, where Mr. William Pierce was master, and about a week or 10 days after came in Ye Pinnace, which in foul weather they lost at sea, a fine new vessel of about 44 tun, which ye company had built to stay in the country. They brought about 60 persons for ye general, and some of them being very useful persons, and became good members to ye body, and some were ye wives and children of such as were here already. And some were so bad as they were fain to be at charge to send them home again ye next year. These are Jesuit coadjutors set out to destroy the Plymouth colony, sent by the Black Pope and his master, Satan. Also besides these, there came a company that did not belong to ye general body, but came one there particular, and were to have lands assigned them, and to be for themselves, yet to be subject to ye general government, which caused some deference and disturbance amongst them, as will after appear. These passengers, when they saw their low and poor condition ashore, were much daunted and dismayed, and according to their diverse humors were diversely affected. Some wished themselves in England again. Others fell a weeping, fancying their own misery in what ye now saw, what ye saw now in others. Others, some pitying the distress they saw their friends had been long in, and still were under. In a word, all were full of sadness. Only some of their old friends rejoiced to see them, and yet it was no worse with them, for they could not expect it should be better, and now hoped they should enjoy better days together. You see the devil seeking to destroy optimism when you've set out to do what apparently appears to be impossible. Start a place, a new home, going to worship God and have the freedom of conscience. And truly it was no marvel they should be thus affected, for they were in a very low condition. Many were ragged in apparel, and some little better than half naked. Remember, this is how many of the soldiers in Washington's army at Valley Forge were half naked, with their blood trails from hut to hut at Valley Forge, fighting for political liberty from a Jesuit-controlled King George III. But for food they were all alike, save some yet had got a few piece of ye ship. Yet was better. They have this word YT. I don't know what it means, so I'm just saying ye or yet. The best dish they could present their friends with was a lobster and a piece of fish, without bread or anything else but a cup of fair spring water. And ye long continuance of this diet, and their labors abroad had something abated ye freshness of their former complexion. But God gave them health and strength in a good measure, and showed them by experience ye truth of your word. Deuteronomy 8:3, which Christ quoted to Satan in Luke 4 and Matthew 4. Yet man liveth not by bread only, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth a man live. When I think how sadly ye Scripture speaks, ye must be ye is how sadly the Scripture speaks of the famine in Jacob's time, when he said to his sons, go buy us food that we may live and not die. Genesis 42 verse 2 and 43 verse 1. That the famine was great or heavy in the land, and yet ye had such great herds and store of cattle of sundry kinds, which besides flesh must needs produce other food, as milk, butter, and cheese, etc., and yet it was counted a sore affliction. Theirs here must needs be very great. Therefore, who not only wanted the staff of bread, but all these things, and had no Egypt to go to, but God fed them out of ye sea. For ye most part, so wonderful is his providence over his in all ages, for his mercy endureth forever. And we should remember this when we have difficulty, that the Lord will see us through if we pray and seek his face. And we are going to have difficulty. In the world we shall have tribulation. Continuing. On the other hand, the old planters were afraid that their corn, when it was ripe, should be imparted to ye newcomers, whose provisions which they brought with them, they feared would fall short before the year went about, as indeed it did. They came to ye governor and besought him that, as it was before agreed, that they should set corn for their particular, and accordingly they had taken extraordinary pains thereabout, that they should freely enjoy the same, and that they would not have a bite of ye victuals now come, but wait till harvest for their own, and let ye newcomers enjoy what they had brought, that they would have none of it, except they should purchase any of it of them by bargain or exchange. The request was granted them, for it gave both sides good content. For ye newcomers were as much afraid that ye hungry planters would have eat up their provisions brought, and should have fallen into like condition. This ship was in a short time laden with clapboard by help of many hands. Also they sent in her all ye beaver and other furs they had, and Mr. Winslow was sent over with her to inform of all things and procure such things as were thought needful for their present condition. Now listen to this. Here's the conclusion. By this time harvest was come, and instead of famine, now God gave them plenty. And ye face of things was changed, to ye rejoicing of the hearts of many, for which they bless God. And the effect of their particular planning was well seen. For all had, one way or another, pretty well to bring ye year about, same of ye abler sort and more, industrious had to spare, and sell to others, so as any general want or famine hath not been amongst them since to this day. Back in a moment.
This is the Eric John Phelps Show on 24/7 World Radio. This is 24/7 World Radio, and you're listening to the Eric John Phelps Show.
Now with the Thanksgiving that was established by the Puritan Calvinists in Plymouth in 1623. All right? And so we see here now that they had experienced or experimented in collectivism. They had experimented in socialism, and it failed. We also see how the Jesuits had sent out one of their coadjutors, an Englishman, John Pierce, to thwart the success of the Plymouth colony. I mean, what man of God would want to see the Plymouth colony destroyed or fail, except they were Jesuit coadjutors? So we see that at the end, in 1623, they had a Thanksgiving. In another context, they invited 90 Indians. It was a wonderful time of feasting, and they had peace. They had entered into a treaty with the Indians in the Thanksgiving of 1621. And so God had blessed them as they sought the Lord, and the Indians saw that the Lord had answered their prayers on many occasions. So now, the Jesuits then set out to destroy this feast, this Puritan feast of Thanksgiving. And the Jesuits would foment a huge division in the country over the anti-slavery agitation. Now remember this, as I've covered previously. Slavery is not condemned in the Bible, but the capturing of Africans by other African tribes and holding them on the coast of Africa till the white Catholic slaveholders would come over, because the Englishmen and the House of Lords that controlled the Royal African country under the Stuarts were essentially crypto-Catholics. No Bible-believing Protestant would engage in the slave trade. One of the examples of this is the author of Amazing Grace. He was saved and did everything he could to put an end to it. Remember the author's name? It's Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. It was John, what was it, John Bunyan? John, why couldn't I remember that name? And then he worked in conjunction with William Wilberforce to end the slave trade. What was William Wilberforce? He was a Protestant. So we have Protestants actively seeking the end of the Atlantic slave trade in England, while essentially the Anglican Roman Catholics and the other House of Lords were busy promoting it. So the slave trade, the Atlantic Passage, the slave trade, was most indeed sin, but the institution of slavery, generally speaking, is not sin. So the condemning of America, where this had the original sin of America was slavery. No, it wasn't. That slavery put upon us was put upon us by England under control of the Jesuits, and Jefferson writes about it in a provision of the Declaration of Independence that was not allowed to be in there. And I've read it to you before. The colonies wanted to stop the slave trade, and every time they did it, the king would veto their law that they wanted to pass to stop it. It's all a fact. And so, realizing the evil of the slave trade, the Protestants in the 18 teens started the African Colonization Society, the American Colonization Society, to repatriate blacks to Liberia, to Africa. And it was beginning to work. And I have a letter in The History of Slavery and the Slave Trade by W.O. Blake, where the black leaders of Liberia wrote a letter to the American blacks in America. Told them you need to come here, but if you want to be lazy and don't work, you just stay in America and work for your 25 cents a day. So there was a Protestant Calvinistic movement to repatriate freed blacks of America back to Africa. And this was the purpose of many Southern planters, was to educate the blacks and then to repatriate them to Africa, as I read to you in the great work with Hollis Reed's The Hand of God in America. Well, the Jesuits said, we can't have this. We have got to cause a division in America on both the North and the South, to cause a huge war, a fratricidal war. And before we do that, we'll bring in hundreds of thousands of Irish Catholics as we create the famine in Ireland using Queen Victoria, where we will ship 8 freighters a day of food out of Irish ports to foreign countries and thereby begin to starve the Irish, giving them reason to leave their beloved Ireland and go to America. And the Jesuits would meet them there on the shores and then send them to northern cities, because the Irish Catholics hated the blacks and they did not go into the South. And they would settle them in the northern cities in preparation to use them with the northern Yankee banditti communist hordes to invade the Protestant South. That was one of the purposes, to bring the Irish here, for which the Jesuits caused the famine, which was not a really potato famine. It was a famine of food deliberately caused by the Jesuits controlling Queen Victoria and her British government. So the Jesuits have to incite an agitation. They have to do away with what's historically a Protestant, Puritan, federal republic of these United States of America, built by the 2 greatest states in the country, which were Virginia and Massachusetts. So, what's going to happen? They ultimately foment the anti-slavery agitation, which the great President Andrew Jackson warned about. The great President Andrew Jackson, who was good to the Cherokee, who engaged in a treaty with the Cherokee that was worth $12 million, $5 million of it in gold coin. You can read about this in Thomas Benton's work, 30 Years' View, from 1820 to 1850. And so Jackson said they're going to foment. First was the tariff. Now they're going to foment the anti-slavery agitation. And that's exactly what the Jesuits did with their Mr. Masons. You had Buchanan on the side of the North that will send down Star of the West to reinforce Charleston Harbor. You're going to have Beauregard that's going to fire on Fort Sumter, who was a French Roman Catholic Mason on the side of the Confederacy. You're going to have John C. Calhoun was a Jesuit agitator advocating the heresy of state nullification of a bad federal law, when nullification was to be done by a jury and not by any state government. John C. Calhoun was busy working for the Jesuits to create this divide between the North and the South, even though he did say many truthful things. So now the Jesuits are going to raise up the Radical Red Republican Party. And they're going to advocate anti-slavery, abolition, abolition, abolition. Well, the South is going to say, well, look, slavery is protected by the Constitution. We have the Fugitive Slave Act here, that if any slave escapes into the North, you're going to have to return them. So when that didn't happen, the South said, okay, since you've reneged on your responsibility to uphold the Constitution, we are leaving the Union. We are seceding. And they had every right to. The states of Rhode Island, Virginia, and New York all reserved the right to resume the powers that they delegated to the federal government if and when those powers would become a threat to their own existence. That's in the great work, Constitution, A View of the War Between the States by Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Southern Confederacy. So they got their war. Lincoln calls out 75,000 volunteers to invade through Virginia to get to South Carolina. Virginia says, no, not doing it. We are seceding also, and you're going to have to fight us. Hence, you have the Battle of First Manassas. Well, you have this fratricidal war, and the purpose of the war is to save the Union for the first 2.5 years. But with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which, by the way, had no effect on the southern states because they were out of the Union, his Emancipation Proclamation it's now a war to free the slaves. And the great Bevan Alexander writes of this. He's one of America's greatest military historians, and he writes this in Lost Victories, his great work. And so now it's going to become a war of annihilation because it's going to be properly coordinated by the Jesuits controlling both the southern leaders and the northern leaders. Lincoln will be controlled by his radical red cabinet, and in particular, Edwin Stanton, that wicked sinner who will contribute to the assassination of Lincoln, which you can read about in several great works. So, you have the war. And in this war, you have Joe Johnston willing to surrender to Sherman if they can go back to the original situation that they had. So Sherman writes a letter to Lincoln or to Stanton. Stanton says, ain't no way. You're going to have unconditional surrender. And Stanton and Sherman said, I didn't come down here to free the blacks. I came down here to save the Union. Of course, Sherman was a very evil, wicked man, because he destroys Atlanta. He's going to destroy Columbia, the capital of South Carolina. It becomes a war of annihilation of the white people of the South, and particularly the white Protestants and the Baptists of the South. And at the end of the Gettysburg campaign, we have Roman Catholic General Meade calling for a time of prayer and thanksgiving, and for the victory, the great victory of Gettysburg, by Abraham Lincoln and also by General Meade. Of course, we see this on page 1051 of The Christian Life and Character of the Civil Institution of the United States by Benjamin Morris, who was a Northerner. And we have here Meade's thanksgiving ordered to the army after they win Gettysburg. So this is a Catholic thanksgiving, because he's a Roman Catholic, and he's got a bunch of Roman Catholic officers in his army. And so Meade, after Lee has deliberately lost the Battle of Gettysburg by ordering Pickett's charge into the guns and cannon of General Roman Catholic Meade and destroying the Protestant Pickett's division, Lee now begins his 17-mile evacuation out of Gettysburg back into Virginia. And according to Chineke in his work, 50 Years in the Church of Rome, he says that a Jesuit rode up to the tent of General Meade and told General Meade not to pursue Lee. And meanwhile, the Jesuits in New York with Archbishop Hughes, Dagger John Hughes, started the draft riots in New York, justifying Meade sending a portion of his army off to New York to stop the riots. This General Meade's going to give thanksgiving? This Roman Catholic Meade's going to obey his Jesuit master by not pursuing Lee in 1863 so that they can plunder and pillage and rape the South for the next 2 years, decimate Richmond and all the other cities? And so now, you have the end of the war. The South has lost. The people have been betrayed by their own leaders. Jefferson Davis was a traitor. Lee was a traitor. The only one who wasn't a traitor was Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who was murdered by Hunter McGuire, the 24-year-old physician and a Mason, when he amputated Jackson's arm and then ultimately poisoned him at McGinney Station. So, you have the end of the war. Protestant South has lost. It's in ruins. But now we're going to have Thanksgiving. So Lincoln is going to have a Thanksgiving. And so his Thanksgiving that he starts is the modern Thanksgiving that we have today, and that was started in 1863 after the practical end of the Federal Republic of these United States with the Gettysburg win. That's the Thanksgiving that's generally practiced today. It's Lincoln Thanksgiving. And this was inspired by a woman, Sarah Josepha Hale, who is known as the mother of Thanksgiving, when she wrote a letter to Lincoln recommending that he have a Thanksgiving. So Lincoln went along with this. This woman was for women's education, which is okay. But she's the beginning. She wasn't for women's suffrage, but she's the beginning of this women's movement. So this whole Thanksgiving is out of communist Abraham Lincoln's victory of Gettysburg and also Vicksburg at the same day, July 4th, 1863. And it will be celebrated until 1939. It's going to be a nationwide Thanksgiving because they seek to unite the North and the South with this common day of Thanksgiving, which the Southern people should have never gone along with. We're going to celebrate the old Plymouth Puritan plantation Thanksgiving, not this new ecumenical union of North and South Thanksgiving. The last thing we want to be is in this empire of the Jesuit-ruled papacy out of Washington. So, in 1939, there's a proclamation by FDR. And it's a proclamation for Thanksgiving. And he's going to change the date to the last Thursday of November. Well, the last Thursday of November is what the original Thanksgiving was celebrating. It was going to be the fourth Thursday. And so he changed the date. And this was known as Franksgiving. Franksgiving. It's ecumenical, it's secular, and it was started in 1939. Actually, 1941. And this is for a day that they can work for the war effort. So in 1942, it's going to go into law in 1942, and it's the same year that FDR starts the daylight savings time. Daylight savings time is wartime, and we're still on it today. So 1942 is the big day for FDR's Thanksgiving. 1942 is the big year, the big day for the daylight savings time in his military government that was established on March 9th, 1933. And so, at the turn of the century in 1800s, everybody was celebrating Thanksgiving on the final Thursday of November. But the Jesuit FDR is going to have it to the fourth Thursday in November, 1942. And so, in conclusion, let us celebrate the original Thanksgiving of the Puritans in Plymouth on the last Thursday of November. Let us not celebrate the Jesuitical Lincoln FDR Thanksgiving of the fourth Thursday in Thanksgiving. That's Roman Catholic Ecumenical Thanksgiving. God deliver us from it, and may we celebrate it in the last Thursday of November. And if it happens to be the fourth Thursday, that's okay. But we're going to celebrate in the last Thursday because we are Puritans, we are Protestants, we are Baptists, and we want nothing to do with Lincoln or FDR and now their emergency war powers military government in this national republic as of 1868 with the 14th Amendment. God help us to see the difference. With Eric John Phelps, back in a moment, 24/7 with radio.